What's up? Welcome, folks. Here is another interview episode for your brain to consume. All right. Today, we have an extraordinary guest who has graciously given us his time to talk about an organization that you're probably aware of, but never really considered the details of. All right. You know them as the ones that knock on your door as you swiftly close it again in their face, usually accompanied by the phrase, "I'm not interested." Yes, I am talking about Jehovah's Witness. Lloyd Evans, who's with me here today, is an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and he's here to shine a light into the organization and his life within it, and his experiences from young to older. He's an activist. He's a very vocal opponent to the practices and sometimes very, very dark practices of this cult. And he's a reference point for people seeking an out, be it on social media, through his email, through his website. He's there for people who need guidance. And he's been very excellent, and he's been very open about this. It's a very, very good thing that he's doing. He's the author of 2 books, The Reluctant Apostate and How to Escape from Jehovah's Witness. And he runs his YouTube channel, John Cedars, which is a pseudonym that he used to write under before he fully escaped. His YouTube channel is cram-packed with information. Sometimes it's dense, but he always tries to break it down in the most simplest way possible, most digestible way possible. But there is just so much ridiculousness being spewed by the organization that it's sometimes so difficult to actually get through. And he does his best to actually bring it to the people, to shine a light on something that we don't even think about. We just see people knocking on your door, that's it, off you go, and you never give it a second thought. These people are sometimes suffering without even realizing because they don't know the damage that has been done yet. And he talks about this quite candidly, quite openly, and it's something that's, to be admired and to be respected, to put himself out there like that and to really try and give an open hand to people and say, come, let me see how I can help you if you are in need. I thoroughly enjoyed the interview. There's a lot that I learned and a lot that I didn't even consider beforehand. And it was absolutely eye-opening. I'll ask you to go and check out his website, jwsurvey.org, for more information. Yeah, look into it, read into it, and you're going to see a lot of parallels with other cults, sects, and religion. So, yeah. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy it, and give it up for Lloyd Evans.
This is Random Urban Memories, brought to you by the Rum Boys. You've seen, heard, or felt it on the streets. Well, we're here to talk about it.
In 3, 2, 1.
All right, Lloyd. Thank you, and thank you for being on here. And for the people out there, do you mind introducing yourself and give us a kind of a nutshell version of your experience in the Jehovah's Witness life that you lived?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. So I am Lloyd Evans. I am a former Jehovah's Witness turned atheist. I am a writer. I've written 2 books about Jehovah's Witnesses, the first one being about my experience as a witness. It's called The Reluctant Apostate. I'm the founder of jwsurvey.org, which is a web resource for those who are having doubts about the organization. And I also run the John Cedars YouTube channel. I'm quite busy with my activism, and I've just found that although most Jehovah's Witnesses, in fact, the overwhelming majority of witnesses are very, very lovely people who are very pleasant, I've just found that they are also being lied to and exploited, and I don't like that, and I do what I can to make resources available so that they have a choice as to whether they carry on with it or get out of it.
And that's very commendable. I mean, you have been through it on every level, and it's nice and takes a lot of energy, I can imagine, giving part of yourself to help other people in that regard. So I must commend you.
It has like an emotional element to it, I think. When you're doing this work, it kind of drains at you emotionally.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I'm currently editing a documentary I'm making for my channel about the work of an organization called Reclaimed Voices in the Netherlands, who are basically a group that is speaking out on behalf of survivors of child sex abuse among the Jehovah's Witness community in the Netherlands. And when you're dealing with that kind of material, it really eats at your soul, because you're dealing with the very worst of humanity or the effects of that. So it does take its toll emotionally, but I find overall the work I'm doing to be very, very rewarding.
Excellent. And you like, I'm trying to work through your back catalogue, and you do have an incredible body of work out there. And as you said, like you're working hard at this, and this has become something that's so dear to your heart. So for the listeners that we'd have, or the viewers that we'd have, as I mentioned in the intro, they mightn't be too familiar with it. I think everybody came across them. I have only certain experiences with them, such as, like I said, calling to the door and then generally speaking, "Oh, not interested, thanks very much," and that's it, But for people who haven't started or who might start working through your body of work and other people's body of work, can you start? We'll start with a clean slate and build on the facts there. So can you tell us, how your journey started?
Sure. Well, like the majority, I would argue, of Jehovah's Witnesses, I was raised in it. I think that, you describe the experience of being called on by witnesses, and that's how most people think of witnesses. That's what they're kind of famous for, is bothering you on a Saturday morning. But I did that job for a number of years. In fact, for 9 years, I did it on a regular pioneer basis, where you're supposed to do it for 70 hours per month, which is a lot of door knocking, I can tell you.
Wow. And that's prescribed, is it? Like, for example, people mightn't know that. I got a message off someone on Facebook, and they just asked, like, what is it that you kind of, how do you determine that? Or
it's not compulsory. It's a voluntary thing. So but what you're told is that if your circumstances allow for it, you should be doing it. And you're even kind of encouraged to think in terms of changing your circumstances so that you can do as much as possible.
Okay.
And one of these ways that you can kind of go above and beyond when it comes to storing up treasures in heaven is to become a regular pioneer. And so that's, again, what I did for 9 years. And it involves pledging 70 hours per month to the preaching work. And I can tell you that in all those 9 years of doing it, I never convinced one person I met on the doorstep to become a Jehovah's Witness. And I'm kind of relieved about that right now. But at the time, I didn't know what the problem was. Here is this wonderful message that I'm bringing to people about a paradise earth where we all get to frolic with panda bears and eat watermelons and just bask in this utopia. What's not to like? And it's only when you get out that you realize, these people all had Google. These people could actually do the checking once the door was closed. And let's face it, that's what you're going to do. If something sounds too good to be true, you're going to say, well, what does the other side have to say? What's the customer feedback on this? And so when you do the digging, you find that this paradise world that Jehovah's Witnesses are selling you and that they've sold themselves is built on the remains of the biggest genocide the universe will ever have seen. Because the idea is that every man, woman, and child who doesn't want to be a Jehovah's Witness when Armageddon comes, and it's supposed to come imminently, deserves to be slaughtered. And so that's a lot of carnage, even in less densely populated parts of the world like Galway. And you're dealing with a lot of bodies and that have to be kind of tucked away under the lawn. And that kind of, for me at least, I would struggle to spend eternity living on the remains of that kind of carnage and praising morning, noon, and night the monster who had ordered it and carried it out. So, it's strange what you are able to accept and what you're able to love, in fact, when your mind has been conditioned sufficiently.
But it's an incredible kind of a dichotomy. It's like for the one side, Jehovah's Witnesses who are at the door wondering why people aren't seeing the light and this beautiful thing, this beautiful journey that they're on. And now you on the other side, sometimes it must be frustrating, even though you can understand it, but it's the answer is right there. You're so close. All it takes is that switch to click maybe, or that trigger in the environment that can actually bring you back. So it's like, it must be a little bit
it's a little bit frustrating, but I find that, there's lots of XJWs out there, there's thousands of us. And I find when I'm interacting with XJWs, you can kind of learn a lot by just how frustrated they are. You get some who are so frustrated that they speak in very disparaging terms of witnesses and refer to them as being stupid and evil. And they will even, for example, go to some extremes of crashing into kingdom halls to disrupt the services, or confronting witnesses in the street and making a scene. But my own approach is the opposite of that. I find that if you're going to have a dialogue, there needs to be respect. There needs to be a willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt to some extent, and assume only the best motives in someone. But I think above all, one of the most essential ingredients in the work that I'm doing is the ability to remember what it's like to be in their shoes. And that makes me less frustrated when I remember, that's when I was a witness myself, all of this made total sense. And so I try to look at witnesses rather than as being these people who are going around lying to people. I remember that I was one of them, and that it all made sense to me at the time, and that these are people who don't deserve to be exploited. And in order to reach through to them, I've got to be patient, and I've got to try and be as calm and reasonable as possible.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I don't think anyone changed anyone else's mind by shouting the loudest. I don't think that's
exactly.
That's kind of a given. And growing up, what was your daily life like as a kid, as a teenager, young adult, and then adult? And what was your interaction then on a daily basis now? Did you ever feel as somebody else, or like you didn't belong, or others didn't belong, that kind of thing? Or did you have people outside that you got to hang out with? Because some religions won't allow that, or some do. And did other people understand that weren't JW?
Sure. Well, I think that when I look back on my childhood, I think compared to lots of childhoods, mine was actually fairly idyllic. I grew up in a nice leafy suburb of Manchester, and in a nice house. And my mother and father were very loving, looked after me and my sister very well, took us on camping trips to Wales every summer. And, we had a nice childhood, but this obviously was a big deal, a big part of my life. And we were under no illusions that, the end of the world was coming. And that our friends at school would die, or deserved to die, in fact. If Armageddon came and they hadn't decided yet to become Jehovah's Witnesses themselves. So, and I think that's one of the most pernicious elements of a Jehovah's Witness childhood, is the fact that you must go to school thinking of your classmates as worthy of destruction. And witness kids are even told, look, you have a duty to preach to your classmates and to your teacher. Your school is your territory, and the congregation can't get in there, but you can. So it's your duty while you're there to teach. You don't just go to school to learn, you go to school to teach. And so that puts a whole new spin on things, and I feel it greatly contributed to bullying that I experienced at school. And I hated school as a result. So how this whole loathing of school influenced my career, my ability to earn a living, I'll never know. I don't have anything to compare it with.
Yeah.
But it impacts you in subtle ways. There are, on a day-to-day basis, if you're observing a Jehovah's Witness family, you might not notice too many differences, but it's the differences, like, for example, going to meetings 3 times a week, which was the case for me. It's now 2 times per week you go to the Kingdom Hall. And those are odd experiences for a child, because none of it really makes a great deal of sense to you. You're just kind of going there to make your parents happy. And there's this kind of threatening element of, if you don't get baptized, not only will you be disappointing your parents, but you'll be destroyed when Armageddon comes as well. So I ended up getting baptized at the age of 11.
Okay.
And I've heard of witness children getting baptized younger than that. In fact, in Watchtower's official publications, the youngest age you'll read of is 7. 7 is when someone's got baptized. And the significance of baptism is that once you're baptized, you're in it for life. There's no turning back.
Okay.
That's when you become eligible for shunning if you ever decide to leave for conscientious reasons, or if you ever put a foot wrong and have sex with someone you're not supposed to have sex with, for example. So, I try not to exaggerate too much, because there were elements of my childhood that I enjoyed, but it was a very, by many standards, it was dysfunctional in some of the stuff that my head was filled with.
Well, hindsight is always 20/20, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what were the daily do's and don'ts? Some religions, you're not allowed to eat this, you're not allowed to do that. Some things are forbidden. If you just run down a small list of those, the kind of things.
Well, we didn't celebrate Christmas.
Yeah.
I got into quite a bit of trouble, in fact, when I was while I was at school, because I refused to colour in a poster for the school Christmas fair. Oh. And my teacher was very unsympathetic to the fact that I was a Jehovah's Witness, and in fact made me stand outside and kind of rather humiliated me.
Yeah.
And that only kind of served to reinforce my persecution complex.
Yeah.
This is proof that this is God's one true religion, because Jesus said that his disciples will be persecuted, and here I am being persecuted at school for being a Jehovah's Witness. Things like Christmas, birthdays. Jehovah's Witnesses don't celebrate birthdays. Easter, Halloween. Jehovah's Witnesses can't smoke, which I guess is a good thing in many ways, because it's bad for you. When I was kind of into my 20s, it really starts to hit you then, because there's all of this kind of sexual repression. Because for most people, they can, explore perfectly healthy relationships, and, they don't have this kind of huge stigma surrounding sex. But when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you are limited in who you can marry. You can only really think about marrying other Jehovah's Witnesses. So straight away, there's a huge restriction on who you can think about having a relationship with. You're not allowed to have sex before marriage. That's a huge no-no. You can be disfellowshipped and shunned by your family if you do.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can't even masturbate. So that's also...
That goes for most, though. Most religions.
So you're really, really kind of screwed. Or not screwed, to be more accurate. But this has a profound effect on you, because it's a perfectly normal side of life that is completely shut off to you or limited, and it affects you in profound ways going into adulthood.
Well, it's such a massive part of people's lives, a human being's life, and it's the same as these segregated Catholic boys' schools and girls' schools and whatnot, and the after effects are actually quite damaging. and this is just one aspect of it that people don't particularly openly talk about, but it's such a sexuality and relationships is what we as humans crave, seek out, and try to be. And if you repress that, especially at developmental age, we're talking damage that can be seriously done.
We're all here because of sex. We're all here because someone had sex at some point.
Exactly.
Whether we like it or not, it's part of being a human being.
Exactly.
And to regulate it in that way, I feel, can really screw someone up. I feel it screwed me up in quite profound ways that I'm still, in some ways, working through. But I think to limit people in that way is very, very detrimental.
And well, thanks for being so open about it. And like I said, these are insights that people need to hear. That again, we're trying to bring people closer to a section of the population that simply believes in other, and it's just for people to actually understand what actually goes on in their people and in other people's heads. And after going through all of these things, which was the trigger moment that you realized that you're on the way out?
I had kind of like an aborted escape when I was sort of 19, 20. I went to a convention. Jehovah's Witnesses have a convention every year. They've become kind of like propaganda events now, where witnesses get shown like a series of videos that are, really kind of quite manipulative. But back in the day, they didn't have the videos, they just had the talks, but they did release like a publication or two every year. And one year they released a book called Pay Attention to Daniel's Prophecy, which was all about the book of Daniel and how it predicted Armageddon and the end times. And wouldn't you know, all sorts of verses in Daniel were actually talking about the early history of the Watchtower movement, and fairly mundane things that had happened in Watchtower history were foreseen by Daniel in the Bible. But I read this book, wanting to believe, and kind of quite excited that here was something that I could really understand, hit the ground running with, and understand from the moment it had been released. And to my absolute amazement, as I neared the end of the book, I found myself actually disagreeing with some of the conclusions that had been reached about Bible prophecy, which was a huge thing for me. Up to that point, I just agreed with everything that I was told. And here I was, my young mind, starting to dissect things and notice kind of glitches in the matrix, as it were.
Yeah.
And my solution, I was too terrified to even write on the page, like even a question mark, because I didn't want someone else to find my copy of the book and see question marks and see that I had doubts. So my solution was to actually fold the page so that only I knew what the folded page meant.
Okay.
And so that was like my earliest kind of attempt at kind of thinking for myself. But then when I was 21, my mother died, and the way you interpret death as a Jehovah's Witness is, oh, well, they're not really dead. They're still alive in Jehovah's memory. And if you want to see your mother again, what you need to do is be the best Jehovah's Witness you can be. And if you have any doubts, that means waiting on Jehovah. I don't know whether you're familiar with the musical The Book of Mormon, but there's a song in there called Turn It Off, which could have been written about the Jehovah's Witness faith. I mean, you literally bury your head in the sand and don't think about stuff that doesn't make sense. And that's what I did. And I really threw myself into my career, quote unquote, as a Jehovah's Witness. And I ended up going to ministerial training school, which is kind of a big deal for witnesses. It's now called the School for Kingdom Evangelizers. It's where you have like an intensive training course that's designed to make you more useful to the organization. And not long after doing that, I was appointed an elder. So,
weren't you one of the youngest elders?
You can get appointed as an elder sort of in your mid-20s. I was 28, so it was still reasonably young to be appointed an elder. They do tend to make you jump through a few hoops, especially in countries like Britain, but in other countries where men are in shorter supply, and I say men because it's a very patriarchal system. If you're a woman, you don't have any opportunities apart from being a pioneer. You can do 70 hours a month of preaching if you're a woman, but that's about it.
You can become a supervisor, but never a manager, kind of thing.
You can mop the floor at the Kingdom Hall, but you can't adjust the microphones. I'm being serious. That's how kind of regimented things are with the sexism. But I was going up and up and up and getting more and more involved, and then through a series of events, because I met my wife through the MTS class, because one of the students was from Croatia. We decided to have our first year reunion in his village in Croatia, or his town in Croatia. That's where I met my wife. So we ended up getting married, and for 2 years we lived in the UK. But then we moved to Croatia for various reasons that I go into in my book. And when we made that move, it was like I'd been unplugged from I think of the scene in The Matrix where they take the jack out of the back of the head.
Yeah.
It was literally like being severed from this constant stream of indoctrination, because, of course, I didn't know the language. I was going to the Kingdom Hall meetings twice a week, and it was just like on the Charlie Brown, the teachers going wah 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 wah. It's just this noise in the background. I didn't understand any of it, and for the first time, I was thinking, what do I believe? What are my actual beliefs? And within a few months, I come to the conclusion that I actually wasn't a Jehovah's Witness. That I had enough disagreement with the religion that it was almost inevitable that I would leave at some point. It was just a question of how and when. So that's basically how I ended up waking up.
Well, that's incredible. It's an actual disconnect.
Yeah,
push things along.
Indeed, and I was warned about it as well. One of my friends, because witnesses are very big on reaching all the parts of the world. So any kind of language group, they're going to want to produce their literature for that language group, and they pride themselves on their website jw.org being the most translated website, because their thinking is it's not about marketing, it's not about profiting necessarily, it's about reaching people. So even if there's like a tribe in a remote jungle in Bolivia somewhere, we're going to want to commit resources to producing material that can reach through to them. And so learning other languages is a big thing for Jehovah's Witnesses. And I had a friend who'd learned, I think, Mandarin, it was Cantonese. So he'd had experience of going to meetings when he was in the process of learning a language and not fully understanding what was being said. And he warned me, he said, Lloyd, you're really going to struggle spiritually. And this is not the time. You need to be, you need to stay in England, and you need to build up your spirituality. And I was like, no, I'll be fine. Everything's going to be okay. I still love Jehovah. And he was completely right. It completely decimated my quote unquote spirituality. But what I didn't realize, of course, was that it wasn't really spirituality. It was just blind obedience to an organization I've been indoctrinated in.
Well, that's very interesting. It seems more, and we're gonna segue into actually discussing Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization, and it seems to be more, and I think you mentioned it in one of your videos before, it was interesting, rather than establishing financial dominance or anything like that, it's actually more about spreading of influence, and probably a power play more so than pure profitability, such as Scientology.
That's right, yeah.
I think that seems to be it. And now, speaking of which, can you give us an organizational overview?
Sure.
How are they structured from whatever it may be, councils to elders, and then all the way down of their rank and file?
Well, I'll start at the top. It's the governing body. It used to be that the teachings, the theology, everything was decided on more or less by the president. And around the 1970s, there was quite a big kind of leadership coup, that resulted in the presidential powers being significantly reduced in favor of a governing body. which currently numbers 8, and they are based in upstate New York. And they have beneath them a number of committees. I think it's 6 different committees who handle different areas of the organization. And beneath the governing body and the governing body committees are the branches. So there's a branch for most countries. I say most because there's been quite a lot of downsizing. So Ireland used to have a branch, but the Ireland branch got sold. And Ireland is now under the control of the London branch of this.
Okay.
And there's actually a story to do with that, which I can come to later if you like. But
sure, yeah, absolutely.
So they have branches set up around the world, and these branches send out circuit overseers whose job it is to visit all of the individual congregations. So these congregations are arranged into circuits that are visited by these circuit overseers. And in each congregation, you will have a body of elders. It needs to be at least 3 elders in a congregation, but you usually find that there are more than that. A congregation can number from anything between 30 to 100 publishers. A publisher is a Jehovah's Witness who reports time, whether they're baptized or unbaptized. I actually visited a congregation in Clifton, just past you.
Yeah, very close
and
by.
They had only 11 publishers. So they do have kind of very remote congregations around the world. And that's basically the structure of Jehovah's Witnesses.
And today, in terms of the like going higher up, do you feel like other religions, do they have, or are you aware of that they have big political sway? Like the Mormons would in some states, or in a lot of states. I mean, the vice president is a Mormon, that kind of thing. Or...
There has been a little bit of that. Most Jehovah's Witnesses are entirely unfamiliar with the rather shocking thing, which I found out about when I first started doing research, was that the Watchtower organization spent 9 years as an NGO, a non-governmental organization with the United Nations, which is significant because Witness publications refer to the United Nations as being the wild beast of revelation. And yet for 9 years, apparently so that they could have more influence, they were basically in bed with the United Nations as an NGO. There are similar stories of them having kind of attending political conferences and being involved in as NGOs in other areas, apparently so that they can gain more influence. But I would suggest it's nothing like you have with the Mormons, where it's kind of very overt political influence, because the influence that Watchtower has must be kept below the radar so that the average witness doesn't hear about it.
Yeah.
If the average witness were to hear that Watchtower has been, lobbying for a certain piece of legislation, they would be in absolute outrage, because the idea is that Jehovah's Witnesses are supposed to have Christian neutrality. They are supposed to be entirely impartial to what's going on in world political affairs.
Does that make them more dangerous, in a sense that kind of like without sounding too crass, but the less visible you are, the more you can get away with, in a sense, and the more it's easier to...
I don't think so. I think that witnesses are... the organization is dangerous without whether it's visible politically or not. The danger element with the organization is not in its political ties and the influence it's having. It's with the cover-up of abuse and with the way it completely tramples over people's individual human rights. So, for example, witnesses will, when we're talking about political influence, they'll quite often get involved with, political conferences to argue for religious freedoms. They'll say, everyone should have religious freedom, so why are you imprisoning witnesses in this country because they're conscientious objectors and that kind of thing. So they'll argue for religious freedoms when it suits them, but at the same time, they will strip their followers of these religious freedoms by punishing them if they ever choose to leave on conscientious grounds, which is entirely against Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that you're free to have a religion and you're also free to leave a religion.
Absolutely.
So yeah, there's definitely a pernicious, dangerous element, but I'm not so sure it's anything to do with the political influence or lack thereof.
And this flaunting of legalities, such as the cases of thousands of information on thousands of cases of abuse, kind of thing. How are they still getting away with it by refusing to hand over what is essentially evidence? And case notes and everything else like this? That's a fairly...
Frankly, I think we're just at the wrong point in history. We like to kind of pat ourselves on the back as a human race, and say, "Oh, look how advanced we are. This is pretty much as good as it's going to get." I'm sorry, we're nowhere near that.
I agree.
There's still a lot of deference to religion in lots of countries. There's nowhere near enough separation between church and state. This is true in America, where you have an organization that is brazenly taking records about child abuse and managing those records without any willingness to divulge the information to authorities, and yet still gets tax-exempt status. In the UK, Jehovah's Witnesses are also a charity. Hey, you can be a charity and cover up abuse and break apart families through shunning, and you still get to call yourself a charity. It doesn't seem very charitable to me. So unfortunately, we're just living at a point in history where governments haven't yet figured out that religions abuse people in ways other than suicide bombers blowing themselves up on the London Underground. You can abuse someone psychologically. You can abuse someone by exacerbating their abuse by not reporting to the authorities. And unfortunately, governments in lots of countries haven't made this realization yet.
And the internal lawmaking, could you please just briefly describe that? If you make an accusation against another member, how is that regulated? How is that?
Yeah, so there's an entire raft of guidelines on how sin and wrongdoing is to be dealt with. There's a book called Shepherd the Flock of God that only elders are allowed to have copies of. You're not allowed to have a copy of it if you're an ordinary witness. Only if you're an elder do you get access to a book that essentially says what the crimes are and how they are to be punished. And you only find out about these rules once you're an elder and you have a copy of one of these books.
There's some obscene things in there as well.
Of course, the book's freely available as a PDF on the internet, which you find out about when you're starting to wake up. But so they have like their own rule of law where that relies on Deuteronomy 19:15, which says that no accusation is to be followed through on unless there are at least two witnesses.
The two-witness rule.
Which you can kind of understand, back in primitive times before there was DNA testing and forensics and that kind of thing. But we're no longer living in those times, and we're no longer stoning homosexuals to death either. Things have moved on, thank you. But Watchtower still applies that, and even expressly states in this elders book, if the accused denies the wrongdoing and there aren't two witnesses, you should leave the matter in Jehovah's hands. And that's the attitude that elders have towards crimes like child sex abuse, which leads to them not reporting it to the authorities. And I alluded earlier to the fact that Ireland is now under the control. The Jehovah's Witnesses in Ireland are now under the control of the London branch office, which is in the process of moving headquarters to Essex. There was a story that broke last year about a case of abuse I think in one of the congregations around the Dublin area, where one of the elders, I think even one or two of the elders ended up going to the authorities, even though they were told not to by Watchtower. And as a result, they were stripped of being elders. And this was covered in, I think, the Sunday Business Post by Barry White. Barry White, the journalist, not the singer. And so, yeah, that's the extent to which Watchtower enforces its two-witness rule. It will actually punish elders who report crimes to the authorities if this goes against their instructions.
And you had mentioned earlier that there's resources freely available, and I was actually going to touch on that. The last time I had two lovely callers to the door, and what surprised me more, the first thing that popped out was the fact that they were holding an iPad. And the first thing they said is, good evening. Would you be interested? Would you like to watch a 1-minute video on having a meeting or something along those lines? And I just kept fixating on the iPad because it was so bizarre, because all these years they had the bags and the literature and all these kind of things. I remember once had a lovely lady call up, and she had asked me, and I said, thank you very much, but I am an atheist, and I'm somebody who follows science. And she goes, science. And of course, she had exactly something for science, in which she had the literature itself
an anti-evolution brochure, probably.
Yeah, of course. And it was a gecko, and how it had a specific color, and then it was a car beside it which had the same color. And she says, see?
Therefore God.
Exactly. Science uses nature, so therefore God. But yeah, like I said, it was just so surprising to see them with an iPad, and that got me thinking then, okay, other cults, religions, sects, that kind of thing, they all have a no-go list. So we're talking about, what kind of methods do Jehovah's Witnesses communicate? We know that through knocking on people's doors, internet, they have their own internet TV, internet channels, that kind of thing. But do they, for example, influence what can and cannot be seen, or do they just simply very sternly tell them what not to look, and people generally follow it because they just think it's wrong?
Well, first of all, it's changed quite a lot since I was a witness. So I officially disassociated in December 2013, but I'd already kind of stopped attending meetings for quite a while before that. It wasn't until 2012 that they started doing these cart witnessing campaigns. Before that, it was solely by going door to door that they spread the message.
Yes,
but now you see carts in city centres, or even in town centres, and that's a very recent thing, or recent as in the last few years. Also, in the last few years, they've put more of a focus on their website and on everything being digital. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because printing isn't cheap. It costs a lot of money to print stuff in bulk. And so by encouraging witnesses to use tablets and phones more to disseminate information, the organization actually saves a lot of money. And there's been a huge decrease in printing over the last few years for the publications. But I listened to what you said about them calling at your door asking you to watch a video. I just cannot imagine ever having to do that. I never had to do that as a JW. But I mean, imagine knocking. It's hard enough to knock on a complete stranger's door and try and convince them that they're wrong about everything and you're right about everything. That's already a monumentally tough pitch. But to also hold a device and ask that they watch a video, I mean, I'll watch my own videos, thank you. I'll decide what videos I watch if that's okay with you. It's such an awkward thing, and I've heard people say how difficult it is to do that who've awoken more recently. But I just wanted to deviate on that a little bit. But
no, I hear you. It's like your friend turning around and go, "Oh man, you have to watch this video," and you're like, "No, it just doesn't have the same effect."
If it's like a 10-second clip of someone falling over, I'm in. But not like a 2-3 minute propaganda piece. No, thank you. But yeah, they've really moved into video propaganda, and this has actually been been quite interesting with my own activism, because when I first got involved in activism, I was first writing on forums, and then I started blogging, and I was pretty much just a blogger. And I had a big story came out in 2012 about a child abuse case, and one of my friends, one of my associates said, "You know what, Lloyd? There's virtually no videos on YouTube about this. Why don't you make a video?" And back then I was still undercover, so I couldn't present myself on camera, but I just wrote a script, and I got someone else to read the script. And that was one of my first ever videos. And it just so happens that since then, Watchtower has dramatically shifted into making videos, so that it now has a website called JW Broadcasting, tv.jw.org. They're now producing hundreds of videos per year. And I've basically had to evolve from being a writer activist to being a vlogger activist, because there's so much material now being kind of thrown at witnesses that's kind of basically video propaganda, that I'm spoilt for choice in what to talk about. And this material perfectly highlights the ideology and the kind of pernicious elements of the organization. So they've really moved into video propaganda, especially I would say over the last 5 years.
Well, you need to go where it's most efficient, you know.
Exactly, yeah.
And coming from the founding times, how has the organization changed? If you go right to the founding days, and then has there been infighting along the way, and how is it now?
Yeah, well, people who watch my videos will notice that in some of them I have a big bookshelf behind me, and that's my Watchtower collection, and it goes all the way back to the writings of Charles Taze Russell, which go into the 1800s. And so, you know, that's many, many decades, 140 years, I think, of Watchtower material. And there's been huge changes in the doctrine over that period. So when Charles Taze Russell was around, if you were a follower of his, first of all, you weren't called a Jehovah's Witness, you were called a Bible student. And Bible students still exist, by the way, who don't identify with Jehovah's Witnesses.
Really?
So if you were a Bible student following Charles Taze Russell, in the very early 20th century, you were thinking, oh, well, the last days began in 1799. Jesus returned invisibly in 1874 and began ruling in heaven in 1878. And the Armageddon's going to come by 1914 at the latest. And by that time, we're all going to get raptured up to heaven. And those were your beliefs as a follower of the Watchtower movement before 1914. And then, of course, that never happened. So they had to, the successors of Russell, because he died in 1916, had to completely reimagine the religion to compensate for the fact that there'd essentially been a failed prophecy. But what they were able to do is point to the fact that World War I began in 1914. Something happened. Something did happen in 1914. It just wasn't quite what we expected.
Yeah.
So they shifted the theology and said, well, instead of returning in 1874, Jesus actually returned in 1914, and that's when the last days began. So 1914 was like just the beginning of the countdown to Armageddon. And they started putting forward other dates. So Russell's successor, Joseph Rutherford, put forward 1925. Obviously, Armageddon didn't come then. The successors of Joseph Rutherford put forward 1975. Of course, the end didn't come then. I grew up with the understanding that Armageddon would come before the generation who were old enough to observe the events of 1914 before they died off. That's when Armageddon would come. Of course, they're all almost completely dead by now. So that changed.
Very convenient.
Yeah, so it's basically now witnesses are under the impression that the end's going to come any moment, which has basically been how it's been for the last few decades. But when you look at the actual theology, there's been very subtle changes over the decades, which I would suggest have amounted to, on the whole, a very, very different religion than how it started out.
So just like most of them, the required flexibility to adjust to times, people,
indeed,
civilization.
And they've been very clever in pitching this, because to you and me, that's just obvious evidence of a man-made religion. Of course, you're going to have to change as you make predictions, and one by one they're proven to be false. But witnesses are taught to think of this as new light. So the closer we get to the end, the brighter the light is getting. And the reason why they didn't have everything correct in the early days is because they just weren't close enough to the end yet.
Yeah.
So God's gradually revealing, revelation the closer we get to Armageddon. That's what you're taught to think of. That's how you're taught to think as a JW. But what you don't think is, well, hang on, that means that when past leaders were saying that they were being guided by Holy Spirit, either they were lying or the Holy Spirit was lying to them by giving them wrong understandings. So,
and well, these are some very well expected as well. Yeah, the plasticity and how they can adjust what it is that they need, and that they need their flock to believe. I mean, that this is nothing new. Yeah, but it might not be. But from the outside looking in, it's quite obvious. But when you're inside, it's it's just as it is. Apart from those, what other people might know from it, apart from biblical alterations and failed doomsday predictions, or constant failed doomsday predictions, we also have the issue of blood transfusions. I think that's something else that pops into people's head when they think about Jehovah's Witnesses. So.
Indeed, and rightly so. Well, that started in 1945, and what's interesting is that there's a magazine quote from, I think, 1940. I write about it in my book, where they were talking about someone in New York, a woman in New York who had an accident, and she received a blood transfusion very quickly, and it managed to keep her alive. And this story is related in Watchtower's literature as though it's a positive thing. And then only a few years later, in 1945, they come out with this article that says you shouldn't receive blood into your body. It goes against Bible passages about abstaining from blood. Of course, Bible passages that refer to not eating blood were interpreted by Watchtower as meaning that you're not allowed to have it transfused into your body. By 1961, it was a disfellowshipping offence to receive a blood transfusion. It's since changed so that you can be disassociated as a Jehovah's Witness if you receive a blood transfusion willingly and unrepentantly, because this is interpreted as you signalling that you no longer want to be a Jehovah's Witness. But it still amounts to threatening someone if they ever take the blood in. But if you're a Jehovah's Witness, this is something where you don't feel any shame over it. You feel entirely justified. This is a way in which the organization is staying true to what is written in the Bible. But what you don't consider for a moment, well, you do hear people say, well, they didn't have blood transfusions in Bible times. So how on earth could the Bible writers have been writing with this in mind? And you say, oh, well, that's irrelevant. The fact is that you're not allowed to receive blood into your body. But you don't consider that, for example, you had multiple conversations between Jesus and the Pharisees, where Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees for applying the law to the extent where people are suffering. Yeah. So, for example, Jesus says at one point, if your bull falls into a pit on the Sabbath, are you really going to let your bull die in the pit because it's the Sabbath and it would require work to get your bull out of the pit? Of course not. You're going to do what you can to save your bull's life. Well, he was applying, it turns out, to a rabbinic principle called Pikwach Nefesh, which means that life comes first. Life comes above the law.
Yeah.
But because Watchtower leaders aren't that well versed in Bible scholarship and don't understand these things, they have this kind of very black and white dogmatic way of interpreting the scriptures.
Cherry-picked.
Exactly. And unfortunately, it's resulted in, it's been estimated that it has resulted in tens of thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses dying through refusing blood.
And knowing all this, there is, of course, very serious repercussions, personally, socially, to waking up and exiting. What is the reasoning, the justification, and what's the process actually called? And of course, then what are the ramifications of this? Because I follow you on Twitter, and because of that, I see comments and tweets that you like. And some of them are very uplifting in terms of people waking up and seeing life afresh, that kind of thing. But then there's others that I found very dark. In terms of, I think it was a recent one where somebody had tweeted, "I've just lost my brother because of shunning, and he couldn't steal." These kind of things. So could you just talk about the process itself and the ramifications of it?
Well, it all depends on the individual circumstances. So, let's say that when those people turned to your door with the tablet, and you watched the video that they wanted you to watch, and you were persuaded to join Jehovah's Witnesses, and you got baptized, and you maybe spent, let's say, 2 years as a Jehovah's Witness before realizing that you'd been completely scammed and getting out. It's likely that the ramifications would be minimal, because presumably your immediate family, none of them are Jehovah's Witnesses, and presumably most of the people you grew up with aren't Jehovah's Witnesses. It's just these people who you've known for a very brief window in your life who are now shunning you. But if you have grown up as a Jehovah's Witness and everyone you've ever known is a believer, it's a monumental thing, because apart from having this existential crisis, oh no, everything I know about the universe is wrong, and actually I am going to die, or what should I believe now? If this isn't the truth, then what is the truth? And you have all of these issues going around in your head. On top of all of that, you're thinking, everyone I've ever known is going to start shunning me. And imagine if you're in a marriage. Imagine if you're married to a Jehovah's Witness, you're thinking, oh, mate, do I need to get divorced? And if you have children, you're thinking, what's going to happen to my children? And it can be absolutely devastating. And quite frankly, it's so bad that there's lots of stories of people just committing suicide because they just can't handle it. They're like, well, I don't have the strength to go through all this. That's how difficult it can be. And that's probably why you've seen and will continue to see lots of very dark tweets, because it does put people in an almost impossible situation. But it put me in a bad situation. I didn't get diagnosed or anything, but I feel I came very close to a nervous breakdown at one point when I was going through the waking up process, because I was in that situation where I had a wife and I was thinking, does this mean I need to get divorced? Am I just going to kind of wander the world as a vagabond, committing debauchery and all this sort of thing? So it's very, very, very unsettling. But what you do find, though, is that when you leave, there's an awful lot to be said for finally having the freedom to think for yourself, finally being able to just be honest and to be able to say, actually, I don't know the answer to that, or actually, science has something to say in this area, and I'm interested in what scientists have to say, and I'm no longer going to claim to know more than scientists know on this particular issue. There's huge freedom in doing that, and there's also like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, in terms of, even no matter how complicated it is with your family situation and with your social structure, even in situations where you're married and that kind of thing, there's a huge upheaval. But at the end of all that upheaval, there's the promise of being able to realign your life so that you are surrounded by a community of people who love you for who you are, who love you unconditionally, who want to be with you because of who you are as a person, rather than what set of beliefs you subscribe to. And when you finally get to that situation, the way I describe it is, freedom is my paradise, because you're taught as a witness that paradise is about living in this grim world where there are bodies under the lawn and where you pet pandas and eat fruit. No, actually, the paradise is being able to live an authentic life, think critically, and surround yourself with people who will love you unconditionally. That's the real paradise. So that's why among all the dark tweets and the dark messages of people who are really going through it, you'll also see lots of uplifting stories of people who've made it to that kind of pot of gold and who look back and think it was worth it, you know?
No, that's absolutely very, very important. And it's something I think that we take for granted on a day-to-day basis, this ability and this freedom of thought, exploration, connection, socializing, that kind of thing. And and I can't even imagine what it's like to be released of those tendrils that were in that were manifest in every aspect of your life and every facet of your life, now finally being released, the chains being released, and for you to hopefully in a safe way to explore yourself and your relationship to the world, and it's nice to see those things. And like you said, with the dark tweets, those are the eye openers, those are the indicators, those are the ones to see this does go on, and then the positive. Let's hope.
And we need those dark tweets.
Absolutely.
People need to understand
this is reality.
That this is going on, and that you can actually screw someone up in ways other than blowing yourself up on an underground train. There is such a thing as psychological and emotional abuse. There is such a thing as coercion and mind control. And governments definitely need to be paying much closer attention to what groups are doing in this area.
Okay, no, that's absolutely right. And from we'll move into now the kind of the current state of the JW organization. How and yourself as well. How are you being perceived at the moment? Do you still have contact with people from your previous life, if possible, or how would you say, subversive and behind the scenes maybe contact, if at all possible, or are you just?
I'm about as close as you can get to Satan right now.
Really?
If you're a believing Jehovah's Witness, and especially if you know me and you grew up with me, gosh, no, I'm a really, really bad person in the minds of
you're blacklisted.
Jehovah's Witnesses, because you are trained to fear apostates. The word apostate carries a huge stigma.
Absolutely.
If you venture onto an apostate website or an apostate YouTube channel, you're thinking, right, well, there's probably a bolt of lightning on its way to me right now that's going to render me a pile of smoldering ash. No, apostates are deeply loathed and feared. Witnesses are taught that they are liars. There's even material that refers to them as being mentally diseased. And it's what you would expect from a doomsday cult that doesn't want people to see what's on the other side. But as far as Watchtower is concerned, I think that they are very much struggling in the information age. I think that they were built to prosper in the 20th century before the internet, when they could control information, when you only read about something because they'd printed it. They simply cannot handle the fact that you can, for example, jump on Google and get a PDF of the books that you're not supposed to read.
In 10 seconds, yeah.
Exactly, very, very easily, which is seriously undermining both their ability to recruit new members, because they have such a terrible and increasingly bad reputation on the internet. It's also making it difficult for them to hold on to members, because once you are able to overcome all of these fears and paranoias and you do look behind the curtain, it's immediate. It's like, there's no way I can argue with this. So what we're actually seeing is the organization undergoing quite a drastic downsizing. So I've already alluded to the fact that they've been closing branches in multiple countries, including the one in Ireland. They've been reducing the amount of literature that they print, even the amount of literally the amount of words that they have available. It's not just a case of them putting everything digitally. They're literally reducing the amount of magazines that they produce, whether digitally or printed. They've also been laying off staff at their facilities. They've been laying off what are called special pioneers who receive a small stipend to do even more than the 70 hours per month. So there's lots of signs that the organization is in panic mode almost. It doesn't help, of course, that they've got multiple child sex abuse lawsuits that they're having to stump up money for. They recently lost one in Montana that cost them $35 million. All of this is going to eat away at the funds that they're bringing in. And I would suggest that Watchtower needs to dramatically downsize to something more like the Scientology model. If it's going to survive far into the 21st century.
Well, this is something that you allude to, and it's absolutely correct, I think, as well. Through these, what used to be behind closed doors, or very in people's peripheral vision, now through Louis Theroux with Scientology, Leah Remini, activists such as yourself, access to YouTube and all these kind of things, and documentaries that you've been involved in. This is absolutely people are becoming more aware to the dark side of organized cults and religion. So, absolutely, this is a very, very difficult battle for these institutions.
It's a tricky time to be in the cult business.
Absolutely,
which is how it should be. And speech. I really hope that we can hold on to the way things are now, because, for example, a lot of my videos rely on the fair use provision of copyright law, where I get to show, clips of Watchtower propaganda and then comment on them. If I lose the ability to do that, which I know has been discussed in the European Parliament, then it will greatly inhibit my ability to make resources available. So as long as we have a free internet where anyone can criticize anyone, then cults like Watchtower will continue to struggle.
And something like for ex-members, this is a question that was put forward to me to bring to you. Generally speaking, from the ex-members that you know, how do they fill the void if there is indeed one? Like, such as, do they end up a bit more spiritualist, agnostic, atheist, or are they in search of something else and they haven't found it yet, kind of thing? Or do they all kind of settle on a reasonably atheistic level? I don't know if that makes sense, but...
My experience is that it's probably something like 60-40 in terms of there being a slight majority of those who get rid of who are able to get rid of religion altogether, as I have, and they lean more towards atheism and agnosticism. If you go onto the XJW subreddit, you'll notice that it's invariably atheist, although there are still people who find that they are able to carry on being religious after leaving the organization. And my own view is that as much as I would like to see religion kind of put in its place and have less of a say in politics and that kind of thing, I think that we will always see people who are religious. I think that some people, at least in my experience, some people need it for some reason that I can't quite explain, and they need to be accommodated and not marginalized or anything. But what we do need is for religion to kind of be, very much put in its place. But I would suggest that probably a slight majority of those who leave Jehovah's Witnesses get rid of religion altogether.
And a quick one on that. Is there a way to repent and get back in? That's something I was asked as well.
Gosh. Well, lots of witnesses do repent and get back in, but it's because they're still under the thrall of the indoctrination. Once you get rid of the indoctrination, once you see the man behind the curtain, to borrow again from the Wizard of Oz imagery, you can't unsee it,
Yeah.
You can't pretend that you haven't found out what you found out. So, and that's one thing that Watchtower really struggles to get their heads around, because as far as they're concerned, once you leave the organization, you're going to be miserable.
Yeah.
You're going to be almost clawing at the kingdom hall door to get back in because Satan's world is just so terrible and so unforgiving. And there they are with open arms ready to welcome you back, but they can't conceive of the fact that the religion genuinely isn't true, and people are realizing this, so they're not going to want to come back. But if you're still indoctrinated and you still think that it's God's one true organization, and you, for example, get disfellowshipped because you've had sex with someone that you're not supposed to have sex with, then you will need to go through a lengthy reinstatement process, which involves going to the Kingdom Hall twice a week for, let's say, 6 months, and having an entire congregation pretend that you don't exist. And if you can,
that's horrible.
If you can submit to that level of humiliation, then you'll get reinstated eventually, and you'll be a witness again.
That's okay. Yeah. Now we're coming into the last run of things. In terms of the lovely folks knocking at your door, what is the best way to respond to them? What's the advice? Because I want to, and I've changed my views, the more I've gotten into it, is to always remember that person on the other side is exactly that. They're a person. Whether with misguided beliefs or whatever, but they have needs and wants as well. So how do we treat them? Should we invite them in and bring them out of the cold, just maybe for a tea or coffee and a chat? You don't have to particularly listen to the propaganda, because I think they're relatively easy enough to, if you say like, look, can we just talk? How are you doing today? How's your day been, kind of thing? Or what's the best way to maybe send them on their way, kind of thing, without being horrible to them?
Sure. Well, the worst thing that you can do is be horrible to them. The worst thing you can do is kind of be nasty to them, or make them feel in any way as though they're being persecuted, because that's what they want to. They want to feel persecuted.
That's an interesting aspect. Yeah,
that kind of reinforces their beliefs in some way. But if you want to help them, well, first of all, you have the option, if you want to, of asking to be put on their do not call list. So if you really just cannot handle witnesses calling at your door, and you worry that perhaps it might result in an ugly confrontation, that's one recourse that's available to you, is that you can just simply say, well, I've heard that you guys have a do not call list. Do you mind adding my name to it? And they will add your name, and they will at least do their best not to call on you again, although they will occasionally forget. If you want to help them, I would strongly suggest looking up the work of Anthony Magnabosco, who espouses street epistemology. And street epistemology is basically just a process of dialogue, of understanding each other's position, of exploring what people's beliefs are through a series of questions that will hopefully just give them food for thought, if nothing else. You don't have to reach a kind of conclusion where you're right and they're wrong. It's just purely about having a conversation. So if you're interested in engaging with witnesses, I would suggest that there's a little bit of an art to it. And street epistemology is the closest I've come to where that art is being codified, and people are trying to understand how it works and what's the best process to take. So, that would be my advice, just to be as kind as possible, to view them as people who are worthy of love and respect, who are currently being exploited. And if we're going to help them out, we need to show love and kindness to them.
Exactly. And now coming towards the end, very, very important, I think, for any members now listening who have maybe stumbled across this, or who are unsure about what they heard. And I'm going to link everything in the show notes and the YouTube channel as well. But can you just mention a few resources, apart from your details, any resources that potential ex-members can go to and engage with?
Sure. I think the best one is jwfacts.com. That certainly helped me when I was leaving, because it's just purely the facts. It's minimal opinion. It's more a case of these are the issues. These are some of the big kind of teachings and scandals and what have you. And I'm just going to show you the quotes and let you reach your own conclusions on how on what this means. So there's jwfacts.com. There's also the XJW subreddit, which I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. There's also a website called avoidjw.org, whose founder is actually in Ireland. He did a fantastic job. His name's Jason Wynn. He did a fantastic job of putting together resources, including some of the older publications, which it's almost impossible to get hold of. It's no longer under his control, I understand, but he founded it and he made it available, and it's a really good online resource.
Excellent. And now if you would like to put your details out there, your books, how to best to connect with you in case you have questions, where to find you, wherever it may be.
Sure. Well, probably the easiest place to send people is the John Cedars channel on YouTube. It's called John Cedars because that's the pseudonym I worked under when I was first leaving, and I've kept that name as kind of like a homage to my journey. My book is The Reluctant Apostate, which you can find on Amazon. There's also jwsurvey.org, which is a website with more resources for those who are considering leaving. I was also recently on Leah Remini's Aftermath show. They did a special on Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was very privileged to take part in that. So I believe that's showing on the Crime and Investigation channel. I don't know what the equivalent is in Ireland, but that also should give you just a brief overview of what the religion is doing.
Well, that brings us to the end. I would like to thank you very, very much for the work that you do, for being so incredibly kind. And like we've even just throughout this interview, we didn't talk much apart from technical difficulties beforehand. And you're very warm. You're a very nice, warm person, and it's great that you're transferring this in aid of helping other people, and that's something that's to be admired. Thank you very much for giving us your time.
Thank you,
Lloyd.
Shane. It's an absolute pleasure. Keep up the great work.
Thank you very much. And hopefully we will talk again and catch up maybe.
I hope so.
You managed to listen to the Rum Boys talk on Random Urban Memories. Just like and subscribe where you can on all platforms.